Welcome everyone to today's session. Today we're going to talk a little bit about trustworthiness of Power BI content. So my name is Melissa Coates and I'm self-employed. I'm primarily a data architect, trainer, consultant kind of person, and my primary focus is on governance and administration types of topics in the realm of Power BI, trustworthiness being a very big topic within that particular category. Here's what we're going to talk about today. Let's start a little bit of level setting. Why do we care about this topic? And then we're going to talk about some very practical, tactical ways that you can act today and habit changes that you could make today to increase your trustworthiness. So here's the path that we're going to take. And basically, we're just going to build on concepts as we start with shared data sets, data flows, composite models, get into certification, get into some separation of workspaces. So that's our path for today. If you'd like a copy of these materials, you can find them on my website, which is coatesds.com. That's short for Coates Data Strategies. Either one will get you there. And the presentations page, you'll find this one right up at the top. Why are we concerned with this particular topic of trustworthiness? And although it seems pretty obvious that, yeah, we want accurate data, let's talk a little bit about the three main different ways that we can deliver BI. On the left, we've got enterprise BI, where the centralized people, IT or your BI team or your center of excellence, would be managing and delivering content. And on the far right, we've got your decentralized people, the self-service authors. And in the middle is a hybrid approach. And so the data ownership, if we take a look at this first row underneath here, the data ownership depends on who is managing this content. And in this regard, we're usually talking about centralized people, whereas in a decentralized model, your business authors are going to take responsibility for everything, the data and the reports. And so that, of course, really has a big trustworthiness implication, because as we move to the right of this page, we have so many more people involved with regard to publishing content. And it's worth saying that just because it's enterprise BI centrally driven content does not fundamentally make it more trustworthy, but usually it is because there's those processes in place to handle more rigorous testing, more carefully controlled change management, things like that. So in the middle is often considered the ideal state, and Microsoft calls this discipline at the core and flexibility at the edge. And that's because we're trying to centralize and more carefully control the data while still allowing the subject matter experts and who needs to get it done the ability to create reports. And sometimes you see this as IT has to manage the data set. And my position on it is, sure, that's often true, but this technique can absolutely still be used by any content author in any team that wants to take advantage of these techniques. So as we start saying, well, how do we want to think about trustworthiness? When we're governing data, we think about it from these four pillars, if you will, that we have the right data for the right people, delivered in the right way, for the right reason. And I'm not going to elaborate on all of this, but there's a whole bunch of different aspects to this. And we're really today just taking one very narrow, specific approach to it. So specifically, what do we mean? So the first one is what most everybody thinks of. The data is accurate. We have checked for data quality. The second thing is we are using approved and common definitions, right? Things that are understandable by people, preferably across all of your business units. We're all talking the same language, right? We have assigned responsibility and ownership for the data. So we know who to go to with questions or to request support or enhancements and so forth. Fourth, we know where the data comes from. So its provenance and its lineage are key to us understanding by the time it gets downstream to an analytical report, do I trust this? Fifth, we are not duplicating data unnecessarily. And that's a big thing with me. Anytime I ever talk here in the community at events like this, I always have to bring up this topic because it's one of my favorites. But that's a big focus of what we're going to talk about here today. The processes that we use to do our data extraction and our data preparation and our data modeling and get it loaded up into Power BI, we're actually doing that in a good way. And by good way, I mean things like, oh, we're removing manual effort when we can, and that turns around and it reduces risk, which increases trustworthiness and so forth. The content's discoverable and findable by more people that need it is an element of trustworthiness, though we're not going to get into that angle of it today. And then finally, there's basically good expectations of what you can and can't do with the data. And a lot of times we start looking at this from the angle of sensitivity labels. So just to reiterate, I'm classifying security separately from trustworthiness. We're not really going to talk about security per se today, although they're all interrelated. We're really just focusing on how do we make sure the content you produce is reliable. So let's start with shared data sets. And that's basically saying I want to reuse this model across more than one report. Where a lot of your content authors start is, let's say I have the need for 3 different reports, and they're all sales reports, but we end up with these separate Power BI files or the PBIX files. Every report has its own data set, and because they're all sales, there's a lot of duplication happening across these 3 files. And every brand new author is going to start doing this, but it's a matter of educating them at some point that you can progress past this state, especially if you're going to produce quite a bit of content. And so let's say the author realizes, yeah, I don't want to maintain these 3 data sets with duplicate data and duplicate calculations, etc. So one thing they might do is say, well, let me just put it all back into one Power BI file. And that might work. But when you start getting into a whole lot of different report pages, it can get a little bit unwieldy if people are using the workspace or the Power BI file to consume that content. So the goal where we want to take report authors with this is thinking about that habit change of decoupling your data set work and your report work. So quite literally, I mean separate Power BI desktop files. So in this case, I'm showing 4. That's where the concept of a shared data set comes in. So for instance, I might have this sales data set, and I've got 2 different reports that are going to connect up to it because they're in separate Power BI files and we don't want to copy the data unnecessarily. We're going to use what we call live connection. We can do the same thing with Excel reports. We can also do the same thing with paginated reports, although I don't have it on the page. And if you've heard people ever talking about the term golden data set and thin reports, that's what this is. And then some people also call it the hub and spoke method, though that's not quite as popular of terminology. The reasons we really like to do this is that first, different people can start handling your data modeling and your report development responsibilities. And it absolutely promotes that idea of discipline at the core, where the data set itself with all of the relationships and calculations, etc., are all maintained once and more carefully. This reduces our risk. So, fewer inconsistencies across our Power BI files. When we need to change calculation, we have less maintenance. When we need to do our data validations, we can target the one single shared data set for doing that. From a governance perspective and compliance concerns, you'll make those people happy if there's one data set to validate and worry about, as opposed to 40 of them, for instance. A great example is, let's say you need to find everywhere that customer name is being stored. You think they're going to be a lot happier if it's just in one place? You betcha. Usability is improved as well. So reports can handle individual use cases as opposed to one Power BI file that's got 40 report pages and is trying to do too many things to be usable. And that means less report pages makes it just easier for people to utilize. And from a performance standpoint, fewer data refreshes is not a small thing. If you have really picky source systems, you want fewer refreshes to run, and fewer data refreshes you have to wait on for your reports. This also opens up more security options for us. So we're going to talk about this in a few minutes, but we can publish these separate Power BI files if we want to different workspaces and secure them completely differently. And that's a great advantage. Now, there are times when this is not appropriate. Every single report or data set doesn't fit this use case. So we want a little more oversight on a shared data set. And so processes such as how carefully we're managing changes to it and so forth can get in the way of being very, very fast of making changes. This also could be an issue depending on who owns that shared data set and if you want to propose making a change, but it's not in your decision-making authority, someone else may or may not be agreeable. Now, I have a solution to that for you. We're going to talk about that here in just a couple minutes with composite models, but it's certainly a factor. And then the final thing I'll mention here is complacency. And what I want you to worry about is that just because you're using that golden shared data set doesn't mean that you have nothing to worry about. So you can still make errors on the report side. Testing still needs to happen. So don't be complacent just because you're using the shared data set. So let me show you a couple of very quick things from a demo perspective. And if I go to, I've got a sales data workspace, and I'm going to look at my sales data set, and we're going to check its lineage. And when we start getting into using shared data sets, really being cognizant of what reports are dependent on this shared data set is what's important here. So what I want to point out, and we'll talk later about why these are in separate workspaces, but I've got 6 different reports here that are referencing this particular data set. And this is in my demo system, so there's not a whole lot of activity happening, right? But we can see how this one in the last 30 days happens to be the one that has the most activity. And something that's really interesting here, even if I don't have permission to the target locations, and if I didn't have permission, for instance, to the sales analytics workspace, I would just see limited access. So I would know that other content exists. I just necessarily wouldn't be able to see everything. But there's this notify contacts item here. So you don't exactly know everybody that you're emailing about it, but everything that's got a downstream dependency, you can say in this notify functionality, we're going to update the such and such calculation on Friday. Double check if this has an impact to you, that sort of thing. So that's kind of interesting functionality. Now, if I pop over to the workspace where my reports exist, and I'm going to take a look, for instance, at product sales analysis, and I'm going to look at the lineage for this. Now, whereas what we were just looking at a second ago was more about downstream impact. So that was really more about impact analysis. This, when we're coming from the report side, is more about the upstream lineage. So where does the data come from? And if I highlight it, it's a very different experience. So you've basically got the downstream and the upstream approaches that you are coming from there. So if you've been thinking, well, Melissa, yep, shared data sets are great, but we can take this concept one step further. That's true. And so let's talk about that. Let's talk about data flows. And what data flows is trying to solve as its primary use case is, let's say I've got a couple different Power BI files, and we've got the data preparation where we're transforming the data model, the relationships. And this piece here where we're transforming data, so basically inside of Power Query, the query editor, that can end up being a lot of effort and a lot of work. And what if you want to reuse it across various Power BI files? That's what this is solving first and foremost. So let's say I've got 3 different shared data sets, and they serve a whole bunch of different reports, right? And I want these 3 different data sets to have the same data preparation activities that are made available to them. So let's say I've got one, customer master data flows. There's going to be other data sources that I'm just not showing. What's happening here is you move that data preparation work out of being done inside of one Power BI file in the query editor, and instead we're going to use Power Query Online. So this helps us a few different ways. Now, if you've got different people who handle data preparation from your data modeling, from your report creation, we can start decoupling that effort even further. We can also shield our data set authors from the tougher source systems. So here's my 3 data sets, right? They're all actually getting sourced from the data flow. So they don't have to know all those tricky rules that the data flow used to go back and get its data from, 3, 4, 5 different complex, possibly data sources. And because we're giving them a starting point, you are reducing the effort for your data set authors. So even if you work in, say, a business unit and you might produce content for others in your business unit, you can absolutely take advantage of this sort of activity. From a more enterprise perspective, let's say we've got some data that is commonly used across all of our organizational boundaries, date, customer, etc. Other things that are useful across boundaries are things like annual budgets, or even things like standard security mappings. And by that, I mean, data that we can use to implement row-level security, stuff like that. So the reuse of common data. We can take additional advantage of investments in something like our data lake, if in fact we hook it up properly, and it's informally known as bring your own data lake. But if we configure it to do this, the data for the data flows is available for us to see and download and interact with us that is stored in Azure Data Lake. Technically speaking, it's always stored there, but unless you configure it correctly, you don't actually see it. It's just invisible to us, a customer, seeing as it's software as a service. If you have some authoritative data sources, you don't have a data warehouse, this is at least one way that you can start to make data available more broadly. We talked about this with shared data sets, same thing with fewer queries to the source systems and simplifying things for our report authors. So this is really helpful if you've got systems that have limited availability or are just difficult to work with. So if you take this idea and extrapolate it out to dozens and dozens and dozens of data sets, that can make a really big difference. Finally, the last point is just improved consistency. So if you start investing in data flows, my suggestion is put as much as possible into the data flow that you can from a perspective of making the tables and column names friendly, assign proper data types, add your calculated columns, get rid of stuff you don't need, and so forth. And that's because that will take the effort off of the people doing the work at this next level, your dataset authors, but it doesn't limit them. And let me show you what I mean by that here. So first, let me go to my common data workspace. And I have got one data flow sitting in here, super simple. It's got 3 different tables: customer, date, and machine. So if I go into edit data flow, you can see that if I go in and I just do an edit here, the only point at this point that I really want to make is that this is the same familiar Power Query experience that you have inside of Power BI Desktop. And if in fact you still like to do all of your work inside of Power BI Desktop instead of the web, you can always copy and paste the M script up into the advanced editor and you're good to go. But the other point that I'd like to make, if I pop out of here for a second and go to Power BI Desktop, and if I do a get data, if I go to Power Platform and I choose Power BI Data Flows and connect, and there's my common data. Here's my company-wide DW tables. And if I choose them all, and if I hit transform data, the point that I want to make is that that is just a data source. We're coming into Power Query here, so we're adding a convenience for your dataset authors without removing their abilities or capabilities to further customize for their particular needs that they have. So let's take this concept of data reuse one step further with the idea of composite models. So stepping back to when we talked about just the shared data sets, when we make a live connection, a traditional regular live connection, the big limiting factor there that's always been is that, well, everything I need has to be in that data source. It has to be in the shared data set or the analysis services model. And so what this new capability is seeking to do is to do the same thing that I just made the point with for data flows, right? Like here's a starting point, but you can keep customizing. That's what this new capability that's called Direct Query for Power BI datasets and Azure Analysis Services. So it's a mouthful. Most people in the community are just calling them composite models, though that's got a little bit more of a definition beyond this one particular feature. So what we're seeing here on the screen is that I've got at the top here the one main model, and usually we're talking about that's something that the Enterprise BI team has made available, and then perhaps the departmental authors here at the second level are going to create their own set of data sets, add in additional sources as necessary, could maybe be Excel and flat files, could even be another data flow, could be web services, can be whatever you need. And that's a great way to basically bridge that enterprise BI and full self-service BI with the ability to customize and augment. So to do this, what's actually happening is, let's say we start with our organizational data set. We're just going to call this sales data. And in this particular case where we're talking composite models, this is known as a remote model. And what's going to happen is we are going to have our live connection. It starts off as a live connection from our Power BI desktop file, but we're going to convert it to be direct query. And that means now I have a local model. And just that flip makes it so that then we can start augmenting it with that extra additional data that we need. So there's basically two things that are happening here. The first one is that we can extend that centralized model, right? New data sources, new measures, etc. The other is that we could personalize it. Maybe we need to rename something. So when we're dealing in this local model, it's just a metadata change only. So perhaps the main model calls this sales returns and allowances. And, down here, we just want to call it returns or something, some simple example such as that. So as you can expect, this once again starts to facilitate that idea of different people can manage different data sets. And those data sets can have different scopes of use cases and people that they're serving. Once again, this promotes that discipline at the core that might be happening really heavily up here at the top one, and then maybe of a medium level down here, depending on the scope of how many people it's delivered to, etc. And fundamentally, this is just less duplication of effort for everyone involved and reducing our risk. So we're reusing the data from that very top level model without duplicating again, one of my favorite things. And of course, inconsistencies, compliance, etc. We're happier there. Now, it's not all fun and games. Certainly, we have to do some testing. This is a remote model. It'll never perform as well as the local model where everything is imported. And this is new. Then this is a very big deal. So it's still a new feature. It's only a few months old. There are some limitations with anything with Power BI. We're going to see it evolve and grow over time. So that brings us to my favorite topic, is certification. We've been talking about data reuse so much. So let's start thinking about, when do we want to start letting people know how trustworthy is this data that you are seeing? And that's what certification is all about. But first, let's kind of level set a bit here. We have two types of endorsements, and certification is really just one of them. Certification means I, as the author, want to signify that this content is trustworthy, and that means some rigor has occurred to make sure that that is true. And so not only do we ensure that the data is validated, but other activities might occur as well that we'll talk about here in a second. So most often, the ability to certify content is highly restricted to a certain number of people in the company, not everybody. As opposed to the promoted endorsement, where anyone who has edit rights to the content can set it to be promoted. So that's more of just an amplification that, hey, this content is available. And that doesn't mean that it's not trustworthy. It just means that it's something less than certified. It hasn't gone through all of the requirements to be certified. And so sometimes the promoted endorsement for the big companies that just have a hard time getting that certified endorsement to happen. Sometimes some decentralized business units actually kind of use it as the same thing, but that depends. So really just make sure people know what it means, because the promoted endorsement is much more vague about what it really means. There's three broad categories of things that can be endorsed. We've got our data, we've got our reports, and we've got our collection of reports and dashboards in an app. And this distinction is actually really, really important about what am I endorsing, because it affects the purpose of the endorsement. So let's talk first about data certification. So if I am certifying a data set, the next level down of people that are going to use this certified data set are my report authors. So that means they are saying, I will trust this data set and I will accept it as a dependency in this set of reports that I am building. Similar concept for data flow, but we just changed the level a little bit. We are saying that this data flow is trustworthy and that data set authors, who are at the next level down, are willing to accept it as a dependency for building their own data sets. So data certification is very much targeted to authors of content, whether it be reports or data sets, depending on which one we're talking about here. Whereas when we start talking about report certification, we're really asking the consumers of the report who are going to view it and make decisions on it to trust that this report contains trustworthy and accurate information. So certified reports is more about helping consumers. Certified apps, since an app is a collection of reports and dashboards, that's also targeted more towards the consumers of the app to trust all of the content in the app to make business decisions. And that's where things can get just a tiny bit tricky. So what I'd like to do is show you a couple things in demo mode here. So let me go back to my sales analytics workspace. And if I sort, I've got 3 different reports. 2 of them are certified and 1 of them is promoted. So call center stats is the one that's promoted. But if I reduce my resolution here a little bit, the other thing I want you to notice is there's a whole bunch more yes flags for what's going to be included in the app than what's set to be endorsed at an individual level. Now, if I go up here to the ellipses and I edit the app endorsement, this is saying that, yep, I have got everything that's got that yes flag set in the workspace. All of the reports and dashboards that are going to be part of the app are going to be set to be certified. So what I'm trying to indicate here is that I have a bit of a mismatch in the items that are certified and promoted inside of my workspace versus what's in the app. And this one's a little bit odd, right? It's promoted as opposed to certified. So little mismatch going on. If we go and we view the app, regardless of which report that I view here along the top, and darn it, this was looking okay earlier before we started, but now it's acting up again. There's a new Firefox update that is cutting off the top of the page, but you can see at the top that the certified endorsement is showing at the top of the page, and that's coming from the app endorsement. And even if I look at call center stats, which is promoted, or if I look at some of these other ones that don't have a endorsement inside the workspace, they're going to be set, or shown, I should say, as certified when you're in this view. Now, the other thing that I want to point out is if we go back to Power BI Desktop, and no, I don't want to save anything that we've been doing. Discard those. If I do a get data, if I go to Power Platform and I say I'm looking for Power BI data sets, the thing that I want to convey is that data discoverability is enhanced when you use these endorsements. And how that happens is, as a data set author is, or in this case, I'm a report author looking for a data set. The ones that have an endorsement appear at the top of the list. So it's far more likely that I'm going to choose sales data than some other sales related data set that's farther down in the list. Someone asked me recently, could I remove data sets from showing up on this list that I don't want people to use. And really anything on this list that's going to show up really is happening because there is at least view permissions or read permissions on the data set. So you'd have to actually remove permissions to remove it from this particular list. In particular, it's the build permission. The other thing that I want to mention with regard to certification, you heard me say earlier that it's limited in most companies to a pretty small number of people. So in your tenant settings, your administrator has the ability to say who's allowed to certify content. And so usually there's one or more groups that are set up to say, these are the collection of people that's allowed to certify content. So that's a really important thing to manage well and communicate well who's allowed to certify content. That brings us to using separate workspaces. You've actually seen this already in my demos a little bit, so let's talk about it. We've got our single data set that's shared amongst various reports. Let's say I publish that to my data workspace and I publish the reports to a report workspace. Why would we want to bother with this extra level of publishing to separate workspaces? Well, first of all, it's about permissions. So if you have ever been in a situation where everything's in one workspace and people that are editing reports say, I promise I'm not going to touch the data set, this will solve that. So let's say you've got your centralized people or certain subject matter experts and data authors. They would have a workspace role, such as contributor or member or admin, to the sales data workspace to let them publish the content up there as necessary. And that would be very few people usually, compared to more report authors that are allowed to publish content down in the report workspace. So how that would be managed is they would have a workspace role down in the report workspace with contributor, member, admin, plus what we call build on the data set, which means not only can I read the data, I'm allowed to create new content from it. So that has a lot of really great advantages because we now have clarity on who owns and edits the content. So here I'm showing a couple of different data workspaces. I'm showing a couple of different report workspaces. I've even put the data flows in their own workspace. So if different people have different responsibilities, you can actually set up your security roles in the workspaces to align with that. And that helps with clarity on who's owning and managing what, as opposed to a situation where a whole bunch of stuff's in one workspace and you have to manage or remember somehow that so-and-so is taking care of this over on IT and we're taking care of other types of content. The build permission is a great way to be able to say who's allowed to build their own reports in addition to read the content. And another excellent side effect is that means row level security works, because up here on this data set, as long as you don't have edit permissions to this workspace, you can implement row level security, and that's sometimes a big challenge. The downside, we have more workspaces, and it might be more workspaces for users to navigate if they go and consume content that way, as opposed to relying on apps pretty heavily. So the final thing that I will cover, and then we should have a few minutes for me to check questions that are available over in the Q&A pane, is we've gone through all this work. And how do we help the people that are viewing the content recognize that it is indeed trustworthy? So you heard me say earlier that the certified endorsement should have some rigor to make sure that it's a meaningful thing. And so when we're certifying data, at a minimum, I suggest checking the data sources and the lineage, that they are valid, because sometimes flat files aren't allowed, or you want to make sure that flat files are stored in the proper place, right? Things like that. You want to do a tech review of the data model. You want to do a security review. Check for data accuracy. That's the most obvious one. And a documentation review. A lot of times certified content should also have a set of documentation that is required. It doesn't necessarily have to be extensive, but there may be a requirement for that. And that might help future you manage the data set as well. And report certification, I suggest that obviously the report content needs to be reviewed as well, right? Is the content being conveyed accurately, using common definitions, etc. And then the data review might be slightly lighter. Now, all of that really depends on what you need and what you're trying to accomplish. So one thing that you might do is include some report documentation right along with your content. So there's a couple different ways that we can do that. One is a page inside the report. One is a page inside the app. So sometimes it's just tooltips. Or bookmarks, right? Lots of different techniques that we can do. So from a report perspective, though, helping people understand the purpose and the business rules and maybe the data sources that are being reflected on this report are meaningful, things like that. And then more narrowly, you might allow certain people, not necessarily every report consumer, you might allow them to see a change log of what's changed and when on this particular data set. And then if you've got a nice repeatable data validation process set up, they might even be able just to go and use a report that checks and verifies that themselves. So a couple of ideas there. So let me pop over to the Q&A pane and see what we have to address in terms of questions. I actually do not see or have permission to a Q&A pane. So
no, because we are on regular Teams.
Okay.
So that's why, but we have the chat windows, but there is no question at the moment. But I wanted to thank you about that, also about the contribution you have made in the roundtable that we had this morning. And all the stuff that you were presenting here are such great content to achieve a data culture into a company and to help people to increase their trust into the content. So that's super nice, and it was really a flawless presentation. Oh, I see that there is maybe a question in the chat.
Okay.
No, just the thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. Well, while we see if any final questions come in, the last thing that that I will show is in my sales data workspace. When we talked about targeting to different ones, you might say, well, Melissa, this is a data workspace. Why are there reports? And so one technique that you could use, now these are not pretty, but they get the job done, is using a report page that goes along with your data set for that documentation. And that way you don't actually have to go and continually delete the report page as well. So that's one technique that you might use.
That's a really nice idea. I really encourage people to go to the website of Melissa, because there are a lot of content there, and it will really help you to build architecture. You will have a lot of schema, a lot of ID. It's one of the most wonderful websites on Power BI since the beginning. Melissa, your end-to-end map, they are amazing as well. So thank you for that and for your contribution to the community. I wanted to say that.
Thank you very much. You're very welcome. Here, I'll show you what she's referring to. Under my community resources, there is a diagrams page, and there is the ever-growing, ever more dense end-to-end diagram. So you can download a copy of that if you'd like. What's really helpful for that is if there's people in your company that think, oh, Power BI is just a query tool, right? And you need to start talking to people about getting things to work that either interact with other systems or getting security set up properly or whatever. This can kind of help convey how wide and deep the platform really is.
Yeah, it really does. So thank you again for that. So this session was recorded. It will be published soon on our YouTube channel as well. And we will provide the slides, if possible, to the people.
Super. Yeah, absolutely. And I said this at the beginning, but in case you joined just a little bit late, on my presentations page, you can find a copy of the slides to download. They're available now.
Excellent. Thank you again, Melissa.
Thank you for having me. Bye, Isabel, and bye, everybody. Have a great rest of your conference. I think you got one session left.
Yes, absolutely. So stay tuned for the Matthew session. It's just coming after Melissa, and there is other session as well. But if you are really into Power BI, you stick with this track. Thank you. Bye.
Super. Bye, everyone.